Thank you for setting me up to talk about this. I know that you and many other Black people know the answer, but it is something that I'm still processing, and it hits me really hard in the gut. And so I want people to understand that I am answering the question, what do I know? I'm not speaking for anyone. Many commenters today have pointed out how many affluent Black towns have been created and destroyed throughout United States history, and most non-Black people know about the Tulsa Massacre, Black Wall Street, Lake Lanier, but it was many Black towns. One commenter said over 60. And it's not that some Black people sometimes were able to establish a successful community that accumulated wealth. It's that Black people were consistently able to go anywhere and together establish strong communities that accumulated wealth and had education systems and businesses and were thriving. And every time it happened, people destroyed them. And then as you progress through time, it becomes less acceptable to burn and flood and massacre entire towns. So again, you have the passing of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, and the United States opens the door to Asian immigration in 1965. The United States has a long history of using immigrants to get in the way of Black people. And so I think that this system of using immigrant-owned businesses in Black communities is designed to siphon wealth away from Black communities. And another commenter asked me, why do I think that people are afraid of letting Black people build their communities and accumulate wealth and to thrive? And we see it so many times. It's because they fear revenge, because they know what they have done to Black people. But again, we have been told that if Black people wanted revenge, it would have happened already. That is not what they want. And I think that people think that the violence and exploitation and abuse of power that they have exacted upon Black people and all Black, brown, indigenous, and people of color is a universal human trait, and that if anybody has that wealth and power, then they would return that evil in kind. But it's not. It is specific to, and all Black people want is to be allowed to thrive and accumulate wealth and exist as other people have been allowed to do.
The historical system of the Western colonization has indeed fostered a lot of naysayers, and who knows, this could be one of the reasons why the Western world has refused to accept the fact that Africa is a continent of its own that can thrive amidst other continents.
I find that a good way to help people who have a different lived experience than you exercise empathy for the struggles that you face that they may not be familiar with is to help them understand. And I was hoping that you could help me understand what anti-white racism looks like. Can you tell me about how you don't know where your ancestors came from because they were kidnapped and enslaved? Or how you don't know what languages they spoke, what spiritual practices they had, or what traditional knowledge that should have been your birthright was lost? Not because they were allowed to and wanted to assimilate, but because their enslavers or residential schools forced them to assimilate. Can you tell me about how your ancestors had explosives tied to them while they were building the United States railroads, and then as a show of appreciation, they were excluded from society for nearly 60 years? And could you tell me about the hundreds of towns that were destroyed, like the Black towns and China towns and Japan towns, all destroyed by the same demographic? Can you tell me about the children who were unalived because they whistled at a woman or because they floated in a lake a little too far past the segregation line? And can you tell me how it was for your parents and your grandparents to be United States citizens who were put in internment camps on United States soil? Can you tell me how it was for your family to live in the back of their store because people who look like you were not allowed to purchase or rent homes? And could you tell me how it was for your parents and for you to shed blood, to be treated as human, as equal, and to be allowed to simply share the same space as other people? Can you tell me about the conversations that you have to have with your children about police interactions? And could you tell me about how your mother and your sisters and your daughters are concerned about having children because of lack of equitable access to health care, because doctors were told that people who look like you can't feel pain? Can you tell me how it feels to know that your ancestors lived here for thousands of years, but when you try to come here, you and your children are put in cages? And can you tell me how it felt when a few years ago the president entertained having people who look like you expelled from the country again? Can you tell me what anti-white racism looks like beyond having your feelings hurt, feeling uncomfortable, and having your sense of superiority challenged? And when you're done telling me what anti-white racism feels like for you, could you please tell me why you're not fighting to end racism for everybody? Yes, this is really important. Asian Americans were redlined from opening businesses in white neighborhoods because white people didn't want Asian Americans operating in their neighborhoods and didn't want Asian Americans profiting off of white people. But because the positionality of Asian Americans is weaponized to oppress black people, Asian Americans were being given loans to open businesses in black communities, even though black people were not able to receive loans to open businesses in their own communities. Obviously, the issue of Asian American-owned businesses operating in black communities is a huge source of tension because it is part of the daily violence faced by black people in their own communities when they are disrespected as customers, to the literal physical violence, as was the case of the salon in Brooklyn, where a black woman was locked into the salon by workers while they beat her with broomsticks, to the damage done to the psyches of particularly black children when they are accused of shoplifting. And this isn't a topic that I'm going to be able to cover in one video, but it is a conversation that I do want to start. I think that if you ask some people what was the source of the tension, they'll say the LA riots and what happened in Koreatown, but you cannot mention the LA riots without recognizing the unaliving of Latasha Harlins the year before. A 15-year-old girl who was unalived by an Asian shop owner who thought that she was shoplifting orange juice, but the money to pay for the orange juice was in her hand when she was unalived. To overlook that is to value profit and property over black bodies, which is at the root of the United States systemically racist system and capitalism. But I think that we have to go all the way back to the Civil Rights Amendment of 1964 and then the opening of Asian immigration in 1965. So in 1964, white power structure almost faced accountability to black people. Black people should have started to be able to receive loans to open businesses in their own communities. But instead, in 1965, the United States opened the door to Asian immigration, and redlining meant that Asian Americans were receiving business loans, but only to open businesses in black communities, and black people were still not receiving loans to open businesses in their own communities. So where you have this weaponized positionality of Asian Americans being put in black people's way, of course you are going to have resentment not only over the supplanted opportunity to open businesses in their communities, but also over the fact that the black dollar is now being paid out twice. Once when the customer pays for the goods or services, and then again when the Asian business owner removes that wealth from the black community. And I frequently heard the tension being framed as mutual misunderstanding, where these Asian shop owners didn't know about the civil rights struggles of black people, and black people were not familiar with the culture of Asian business owners. But I don't think that it can be framed as mutual misunderstanding where there is an uneven power dynamic. You have one demographic that is the business owners, and you have the other demographic that is having to pay. So where there is uneven power, I don't think that it's accurate to frame it as mutual misunderstanding. So my ancestors were asked by white men to come to this country, which they had stolen and forced black people to build, because they were hoping that my ancestors would be the new cheap and disposable labor to undercut the recently freed black people that lazy white men didn't want to pay. And when my ancestors wouldn't do that, they were and massacred, their towns were destroyed, they were blown up while building the railroads, and ultimately they were excluded from society and the country for nearly 60 years. Then when the United States asked us to come back in the 1960s because they wanted to put us in the way of black people again, and the United States needed to rehabilitate its reputation with Asian countries that were gaining in economic and political power, we had civil rights because of black people. You're obviously not aware of this, but blessed is not a word that the global majority thinks of in association with Europeans. Words like plague and colonizer, maybe, but not blessed. And the cell phone in my hand came from China. So I don't know if you're referencing Steve Jobs or Martin Cooper or the Finnish inventor who created the first pocket-sized telecommunication device in 1917, and you probably don't know either because your education system has left you terribly ignorant and without the critical thinking skills necessary to effectively gather information. Because you believe that most great inventions can be attributed to one white person, as opposed to recognizing that the patent system is how white people colonize intellectual property. We would not have cell phones if it wasn't for the creation of the gamma electrical cell by black inventor Henry T. Sampson. And most of our cell phones would not have microphones in them if it wasn't for the particular microphone that was created by black inventor James Edward West. The creation of the first digital network, 1G, was launched in Japan, and then black electrical engineer Jesse Russell pioneered the creation of 2G, which launched in Finland first. 3G launched in Japan, 4G launched in Norway, 5G launched in South Korea, and 30% of the world's cell phones are manufactured in China. Because we, of the global majority, recognize that collective humanity has the ingenuity and creativity of one another to thank, whereas a lot of European Americans are laboring under the delusion that the rest of us have white people to thank. And it's this narcissistic ignorance that causes people like you to do embarrassing things, like leaving comments about Europeans and cell phones on a video about systemic anti-black racism in the United States. And while that could be written off as a comedic and senile non sequitur, we recognize it as a desperate attempt to center yourself in a conversation that has nothing to do with you. The irony being that white people like to say not all white people and they shouldn't be held accountable for the misdeeds of their ancestors, yet they want to be associated with the greatness of the things that they think they invented. So, John Michael Kohler was an American who invented the bathtub in 1883. But let's think about this critically. Do you really think that nobody took a bath until John Michael Kohler invented the bathtub in 1883? Doesn't make a lot of sense, right? So what he was talking about is the fact that Africans introduced bathing and the concept of personal hygiene to Western Europe in order to build a healthier society during the 800-year occupation of Spain. In particular, a man by this name introduced the practices of bathing, shaving, and using toothpaste, as well as drastically improving the eating habits of Western Europeans. Additionally, the first recorded history of people taking baths was in India in 500 BC. A lot of us have gotten used to how little history some people like you know, particularly where it comes to anything not Eurocentric. However, I have a tip. Before you make a comment like this, do a quick Google search for whatever you think the topic at hand is. In this case, who invented bathing or who introduced bathing to Europe, and then decide whether you still want to make this comment. Hey buddy, your comment needs some help because when Dr. Earl Haas patented the tampon in 1931, he got the idea from his friend. She used a sponge because before this, women around the globe had been using tampons for thousands of years. There was a medical document that described the use of papyrus tampons that came from Egypt around the 15th century BCE. And I think what you meant to say was this modern nice world was made possible by labor and ideas stolen by white greedy bad men exploited for ruthless capitalism. Because you are yet another narcissist who's been indoctrinated by the education system to lack the critical thinking skills to understand that patenting does not equal invention. Patenting is the colonization of intellectual property, because invention usually requires the collective efforts of a diverse group of people over time. As I tell my students when they're having difficulty learning something, try to be patient and don't be too hard on yourself. The ability to apply logical reasoning to historical fact isn't going to make sense to somebody who watches a video correcting an erroneous comment about the 1800s who responds with stay in the 21st century. But it's okay, we all have our strong suits. Being an ignorant bigot isn't mine, and intelligence isn't yours. But I'm sure there are things that you're good at that you can focus on and celebrate. And if you'd like to get better at being intelligent, again, be patient, practice every opportunity that you have, and I'm sure that you can improve. I hope that helps. Important facets of my personality include kindness and empathy and the courage to speak up against wrongdoing, which is why I spend a lot of time advocating for dismantling white culture and explaining the history of current forms of systemic oppression. And my original intent was to encourage Asian Americans to engage in anti-racist work and to unlearn anti-Black bias. But who knew? There are so many narcissistic white people who show up to center themselves in conversations that don't have to have anything to do with them unless they identify with race, white supremacy culture, and upholding forms of systemic oppression.
After critically analyzing all that this bold Asian lady has said, I will definitely come to a conclusion that the Western world needs to realize that there needs to be a reformation, and yes, Africa is taking the bull by its horn, regardless of all that they have undergone in the past years during the era of colonization. But guys, let me know what you think about all that this woman has said. I will see you in the comments section.